All right, so we are now live streaming. So to anyone who is joining us, welcome. We are in the second week of our online residency in Grid, a collaboration between Goldsmiths and Arbeit. The theme that we're looking at this week is shadow subversions. This theme speaks to ideas around corporate shadowing, thinking through subverting technologies, tools, and platforms, especially now as we're using technologies that have become increasingly ubiquitous, video conferencing apps, project management tools, and more. Such technologies have been described as invasive, surveilling malware, but in many ways are essential to the maintenance of our physical and social well-being at the moment. Part of our public program is to invite outside artists and technologists in to talk with us. Last week we were joined by Kaikin, and this week we're joined by Tiga Brain from America. And I'm going to hand over to Vera to do a little bit of an introduction.
Yeah, hi everyone. Today we are meeting with Tiga Brain, who is an Australian-born artist and environmental engineer, whose practice often subverts and reimagines existing data systems and infrastructure. She has, for example, created wireless networks that respond to natural phenomena and a dating system based on smells. And in her practice of eccentric engineering, she seeks to reveal the edges of technologies to see how they could be reimagined. And this practice is central for our residency as well. Like Becky hinted to at, because of the pandemic, we have found ourselves developing our collective practice over these corporate tools like Zoom. And this kind of new nature of our residency itself feels worth researching over the coming weeks. And I guess in our discussions with Tiga, we will of course be curious about that. What kind of subversions could we use as a residency of more than 20 people online? And I guess, Tiga, you could introduce yourself to us.
Sure, hi. Yep, I'm Tiga Brain. I am calling in from Brooklyn. But yeah, I have been in the US probably probably about 7 years now. So a while. And before that, yeah, I'm from Sydney originally. So yeah, I've been working as an artist in many different mediums for probably about the last decade. And yeah, I mean, that was a really succinct introduction, I think. Yeah, my projects are often looking at the way that we sort of might rethink infrastructures and technologies. I have a background in environmental engineering, and so that really like informs a lot of my practice. So I think a lot about sort of what we count as like success or failure with technological systems, and by paying attention to like when things break or inefficiencies or these moments of like imperfection in a technological system is very useful for showing us how they operate, their logic, what the values and priorities that have been sort of embedded in them are. And so a lot of my work is kind of about sort of finding these inconsistencies or these gaps between like the sort of like imagination or narrative around technologies and then the way that they're actually implemented. So yeah, whenever somebody is like sort of like pointing out a failure or a problem with a particular system, I think that's a really like great starting point for them diving in and thinking about like what can be learned from that. So yeah, I guess, you know, I think I'll show you a couple of projects to give you a sense of how this looks and plays out in my practice. I'm going to share my screen, so let's try this. Is that working?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great, excellent. So I'll quickly just show you maybe like a couple of examples. Let's talk about smell dating. This was a really popular work that I did in 2016. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a smell-based dating system, right? So we ran it as a sort of participatory project, launched it as a website, which is here. You can all see this. Through a publication called Useless Press that was run by Sam Levine, who collaborated with me on this. And this project, as you might imagine, is an online dating service, but where the primary way that interactions and people encounter each other is via smell. So our participants would wear we would send our participants a t-shirt. They would wear it for 3 days. We asked them to, not wear deodorant, but obviously that just depends on, how you want to deal with it. And then send us back the shirts. And then you, a few days later, receive like 10 anonymous swatches from other people in the dating service, so that you can choose who you would like to meet, just simply based on the way that the swatch of their t-shirt smelled. There was a sort of custom web interface that allowed each person to input their preferences, so whether they wanted to date the person or meet the person or not. And if both people were interested in meeting, or were like a yes or a maybe, there was a little bit of ambiguity built into the system, then you would be put into an email together and dates would happen. So this project really emerged out of some work I'd been doing around data visualization, and the sort of deception or the problem with data visualization, which is, it presents these very compelling images and a certain certainty, like it implies a certainty about what is inevitably a complex situation. And how, if you talk to sort of any climate scientist or people who sort of work with visualization a lot of the sort of responses I was getting from these people was, well, how do you sort of acknowledge the ambiguity in the system behind the visualization, or in the data, and the process by which data was collected and whatnot. And so I got really interested in smell because, smell operates with this completely different logic, right? There isn't this sort of it hasn't been instrumentalized in a way that sort of visual information has. It's very potent and powerful, but it has the reputation of being subjective because it's very difficult to describe in English, in language. There isn't a lot of words that capture smell really well. And so I started doing projects experimenting with smell and information, and that led into the creation of this work, which is, really based on this question of if we imagine a dating service where visual information isn't the primary thing that you're making decisions on, it's not just based around this profile picture where we discern so much about class and gender and all sorts of things from that picture. If the experience was smell-based, then where does that leave you? What different decisions would you make? Also that smell is just an experience that is so hard to capture in computation. It's not something that screen-based media can really accommodate. And so again, that got me really interested because there seemed to be just so much to explore there. So yeah, the project involved about 100 people through New York, and there were lots of dates and some relationships came out of it. And yeah, it was really interesting, fascinating experience. That, yeah, maybe we'll do it one day again. I don't know. We still get requests. But yeah, the project was also really picked up by the media, I think, because of the way that it's presented, right? So we really were kind of employing this critical design strategy, which is, adopting the language of, you look at this, it's unclear whether it's an art project, a startup. It has the sort of scrolling website, which is the classic kind of Silicon Valley startup visual language. And so we were really kind of playing into that ambiguity around what the purpose of this project was. Because of its success, there was also a lot of questions of oh, well, can this be a real service? Would you run it as a real service? And I think it also sort of revealed a lot about sort of startup mentality to me too, which is because smell is a material thing, you can't really scale something like this in a way that you can simply scale a purely software-based interaction. In that, you know, when we were doing this project, like our whole lives were filled with like dirty t-shirts and our apartments were full of them. And, you know, it was like this very material experience where we were constantly sort of engaging with people's body odors. And yeah, I think that really revealed also a lot of how the you know, Silicon Valley technology kind of model is this model of like scale via software, where the body is kind of just like often edited out of the situation, right? If we think about a lot of the models, you know, like Uber, for example, you know, care for the body or the body of the driver is not something that is like sort of centered in that system at all. So yeah, I'll give you one more quick example. This is a much more recent work called New York Apartment. It was a commission from the Whitney for their online art commission called Artport. So this is probably, I don't know if it's the oldest, but it's one of the oldest running like internet art commissions around. If you go and Google around, you can actually find their original site, which has a whole lot of projects they commissioned, you know, through the 90s, which is really a really amazing archive. So felt very honored and thrilled to be sort of invited to contribute. And so this was a collaboration also with Sam, and the project relies on a technique called web scraping, which is where you write a computer program to download content from a website, from the front end of a website. And the project, using web scraping, we downloaded all of the assets from like every apartment that was listed for sale in the New York area. We did this project last year, so it was, you know, I think we did the web scraping around October, November. And then we took these assets and sort of combined them to create what is sort of this absurdly large, basically real estate listing. And so what you can see here is like the total cost for the New York apartment is all of the sale prices added together. It has 65,000 bedrooms, 55,000 bathrooms, and each column here, you know, so this is every question that's listed in the real estate listing. So like hardwood floors, like to entertain, looking for a third bedroom, and so on. So it tells you a lot about the sort of, again, the imagination around what is desirable in a home, or as homes become commodities, like what happens in that sort of transformation. So there's every image of every bedroom, and I think, you know, it's also fascinating because you have images of people's actual bedrooms like you see here, and then there's these like very staged, you know, like kind of idealized bedrooms like this one, for example, that, you know, is the sort of like imagined real estate agent ideal bedroom. So it really like kind of lays everything out in this very flattened way. We also downloaded every floor plan, extruded it, and created these sort of imaginary structures of what the apartment would look like if you sort of combined every floor plan. There's video, there's a mortgage calculator, and so on, right? So we sort of like, yeah, the philosophy behind this project was more and like putting everything in and to try to create this kind of like expansive reimagining of what housing in New York looks like. We were also thinking a lot about trying to sort of twist this idea of like housing as commodity and in individual apartments. We think about housing on such an individual scale. What if we thought about housing as this sort of like resource that we as a city own? You know, obviously there's a lot of issues in terms of people investing in real estate and then it not even being used for housing because of the like incredible inequality that we see right now, particularly in cities like New York. So this question of like what is and is not allowed to become a commodity, I think is also really central to projects such as this, but also to projects that kind of rely on web scraping as a methodology, because obviously web scraping is this technique of sort of like taking data and assets from websites without permission. And, you know, if you're Facebook or if you're Twitter or if you're StreetEasy or whatever web platform you have, you know, you have turned that, you know, crowdsourced content into a data set, into a commodity, and that's where you kind of get your value as a corporation. It sort of comes from the data that you are able to amass. So it also, this project and this technique also, yeah, throws that into question and sort of invites one to, yeah, take back some of that content or reconfigure it for your own purposes or different agendas that are not, say, real estate websites or agendas or Facebook's agenda or the agenda that we see a lot of platforms working with. So maybe I'll leave it there and we can discuss a little.
Yeah, thank you so much. Would someone want to ask something right now? We have, as a group, we have been really inspired by your work, and we have collected a bunch of questions that we want to discuss with you. But if somebody wants to ask something like right now, it'd be a good time.
I suppose actually maybe one of the questions that I had leads on quite nicely from the topic of web scraping. I know that another one of your projects that you also did with Sam Levine, the Intergovernmental Panel on Capitalism, was another project where you used web scraping, and I just wanted to ask you some questions about the sort of like the copyright issues that you ran into, or just some of the ethics around actually using this data. I actually took the workshop with you in New York at the School for Poetic Computation, the code subversions, and so just thinking back to some of those techniques and strategies you used, and would be nice to sort of hear more about that for the wider group.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think web scraping still falls into this sort of very grey legal territory. You know, a lot of it is fair use, especially if you're doing it in the context of art practice, right, where I think you can do it under that sort of protection. But yeah, I think the reason it's subversive is because it does sort of challenge these ideas of data ownership, and obviously you are mostly you're breaking terms and conditions of the sites that you're doing this on. And you know, the harder a site is to scrape, the more the data plays into their business model, right? It's usually direct correlation there. So it tells you a lot about what their business model is if the site is super difficult. The project you're mentioning, I'll just quickly, let's bring it up. Yeah, the Intergovernmental Panel on Capitalism. So this is a project, let me share the screen so you can all see. Share. Yeah, so this is a project that, again, is sort of, we took all the assets that had been published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and just through just doing a basic find and replace on all the text and all the images, switched out the word climate change and the word capitalism. So it's kind of like a one-line joke taken, you know, to the extreme as far as we could take it. So we did all of we did their text. You can see that the images we're using, we did an image replace technique. And then we also downloaded every video from their YouTube channel. And through looking through the subtitle files of the videos, did a find and replace of every time the word climate change was spoken as well, and inserted the word capitalism over the top of the audio track, where the word capitalism had been taken out of an audio book of Piketty's Capital. So yeah, you can take a look at the video. It's very funny because, you know, you have these like UN delegates, and their sentences have just been very slightly edited. We did get a complaint. We got a takedown notice for this project, as you might assume, from the UN for copyright infringement. And, you know, attempted to talk with them about why they would find this as problematic, and like, isn't this the root cause of climate change? Is an economic model that's no longer working and no longer taking into account environmental externalities in our societies. Of course, that email interaction didn't go very far, and eventually they didn't take it any further. So we didn't take it any further either, because I think we revealed to them in the email interaction that we weren't really a threat and were, sort of engaging with this from a sort of artistic perspective. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's in a lot of ways, it's sort of a ready-made almost, with a slight twist, because obviously it also is this kind of like rumination on just the language and appearance of bureaucracy and how power then plays out. So, you know, so much of the world happens via like PDF formats, and you know, so much power is kind of like in plain sight, but sort of almost it becomes invisible because it's so like just embedded in these very mundane formats. So I think, yeah, we sort of are often thinking about this, about how so much political, so much power is just, if you want to sort of investigate it, it is visible, you know, it's all traceable on the internet, just like you can surveil us as individuals via what we post or what we do on social media. That surveillance can also be inverted, right? And you can sort of track and find out things about different entities and different organizations, and collect data and produce data sets from what is posted by organizations and corporations. So I think that is also a big part of like a practice like web scraping, is it does allow you to sort of try to play with how you know, how political work can happen, or the politics of the web in different ways. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
No, it's great. I mean, also just, yeah, it's good to sort of share more widely with the rest of the group these different strategies you've been using. And maybe, yeah, hand over to Vera. Maybe she can ask some next questions as well now.
Yeah, I could continue by asking about eccentric engineering. And I think it was your writing called "Environment is Not a System" where I first picked up the term you were using. And I wonder when you started to use the word eccentric engineering, and what is like the background behind that? And do you see your whole practice being about eccentric engineering?
Yeah, I started using that term to describe the work I've done in trying to rethink infrastructures and technologies in different ways. But that definitely spills into these sort of more online projects as well. For me, like, I think the context and the sort of liberties that you are allowed to have working as an artist, in that you're not building infrastructures that have to scale, that like people have to use constantly. So you're sort of freed from a lot of the constraints that one works with as an engineer. So that sort of context allows you to sort of ask questions and trouble like really normative like systems or ways of assessing technologies, right? And so the smell dating thing, for example, right? As I'm talking about, like why that wouldn't scale. as a sort of startup is a really good example, right? Because it's not efficient. And for me, that's really interesting and important. It provides you a very different, it works with a very different set of priorities in a way. And for that reason, like a project like that, we got tons of emails from women who were participating saying, I just feel so relieved that I don't have to put a profile picture up, and smell's so important to me, and I haven't had an experience where I can sort of really think about that. So it sort of reveals how a lot of platforms or technologies favor certain demographics in ways that obviously are also sometimes not even intentional, right? There's these sort of unintended consequences to how something plays out and, reverberates in the world. And so, yeah, the eccentric engineering thing, I mean, it really started for me trying to undo looking at the world like an engineer. And when you look, engineering is a lot of that discipline and that way of engaging with the world is about building systems of infrastructure that are optimized for human, right? So the way that we I was in water, so I often think about water, and the way we design our water systems is to, provide water for human communities. And so then anything that leaks in a water system is seen as a loss, is seen as an error, is seen as a failure, even though leaks might support street trees or other ecologies, or it's been shown in research that, cities leaking actually recharge groundwater systems and so forth. So it's not so I think it's an attempt to acknowledge that we aren't these atomized individuals. We are entangled in ecosystems, and yet a lot of our infrastructures and technologies are still built with that model of the atomized individual. What if we were to say build a city water system that said, oh, well, we want to distribute water to street trees and to wetlands and to bird communities, and we need, if they're not healthy, we're not healthy. And I think that is something that is still, we have so much work to do in trying to build systems that acknowledge that. And so some of that eccentric engineering work, I've also been thinking about in the sort of digital technology space too, right? Where environmental context or the materiality of networks is something, again, that is not presented on the front end of websites. You have the cloud, it's totally disconnected from a place and the river that's probably flowing through it, or the whatever energy source it's using and so forth. So another one of my works that was kind of exploring this, I'll just quickly jump to it, is this project called Being Radiotropic. And this project takes the form of a series of Wi-Fi routers, where each router misbehaves or has been redesigned in a particular way. So this first one is called an orbit, and it oscillates the data speed of the Wi-Fi network based on the orbit of the moon. So for one day a month, you get really quick, amazing internet. For one day a month, you get no internet, and it sort of oscillates in a 28-day cycle as if it's tidal. Right, and so what if we were trying to couple our sort of network infrastructures with natural cycles? Again, slow internet, you're oh, terrible failure, friction, inefficiencies, but could that produce a different register of attention, set of behaviors? And I also acknowledge that this is a totally privileged project that I am making, in a well-connected context. And, you talk to people who are in different situations, sort of rural communities or whatnot, and they're oh yeah, well, my internet does go off when it rains, so I don't know why this is so subversive, right? So I think also acknowledging that consistent, reliable infrastructure is something that is a privileged position to be in. But another one in the series was a router that, in order to bring up the Wi-Fi network, you had to light a candle. You blow the candle out, it goes off. And so this question of we have a very specific, interesting relationship with fire, right? Its combustion has brought great advantage to our civilization, but also great threat, right? And this is a threat we see at the climate change level, but also a threat we see in terms of fire codes and the way that cities are redesigned in specific response to that. And so, yeah, by tying a flame to the operation of a Wi-Fi network, how does that recalibrate our relationship to that network? And they all work, so they're, you know, you go into the space and you can kind of join them and have that experience of being on the network. So yeah, that was sort of the next step in trying to really think about building systems that take what are considered externalities, so things that aren't counted, and trying to like actually include them in the operation of the system itself.
Thank you. Next, we would have a question from Hazel, and as she is not able to attend, I think I could ask it on her behalf. And Hazel wants to know if that your work particularly speaks to power in terms of critique of technology. Do you ever encounter frictions between the ways your work is platformed and the critical nature of your investigation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, an important question is like, what do we think critical work is actually doing? Like, is it doing what we think it's doing? And I think a lot of the like hype around AI, and then how a lot of cultural institutions and curators and artists have sort of latched on to like critical perspectives on AI in a way that sometimes when you're walking through those shows feels like it's actually just making AI look so much cooler, right? And elevating it or reifying it even further. So I think it's a very easy argument to make as an artist, saying, oh, I'm engaging with this, whatever technology it is, and I'm making a space for critical discussion. I think sometimes that happens, but I also think, and this is an old argument that has been a conversation that has been happening in the media art community, like since, you know, the early 2000s, which is, you know, in engaging and in opening spaces for these conversations, are you actually just softening public opinion to these technologies? Are you making them more palatable? You know, you're giving this sort of sense that people understand how they work, even though we don't actually, like, deploying them in a kind of art context versus a state context are like radically different things. So I think this is really something to think very carefully about. And like a lot of the AI work I see, I do not think it's being critical of AI at all. There's a reason why Google Creative Lab exists and invites, you know, the best artists in the US with a lot of support to come and, you know, do AI plus music or drawing or whatever projects, because, you know, it makes that technology look poetic and exciting and engaging. So yeah, I think it's an important conversation to have, and it's important to sort of ask oneself, like, what is the work doing? What sort of imagination is it opening up? I mean, I think the work that I feel happiest with is the work that kind of takes that step of like opening up a space or an imagination for an alternative, right? Like, so, you know, the router thing, like, what if our digital technologies sort of took into consideration natural cycles, natural intelligences in a way, right? Rather than just saying, like, making like work that sort of pointing out the worst parts of what exists. Like, I think that critical work is important, like pointing out the flaws and the failures and the problems. You know, there's tons of surveillance art that does that. But I think for me, the most exciting stuff is trying to subvert or put these technologies into the hands of communities that are less powerful, that have less access, that are being oppressed by the status quo right now, you know, and that's I think really important work to be doing for all of us, particularly after this last couple of weeks in the US.
Yeah, we're starting to sort of think specifically through some of those issues as well, and how we as a residency can start to be having sort of concerted efforts and commitments to sort of addressing sort of systemic racism and things around this as well. So yeah, definitely thinking through these things as well.
Yeah, you should also take a look at, there's a really great book that just got released, Data Feminism, by Catherine D'Ignazio and Laura Klein. And they're really looking at data visualization through the lens of feminist theory in quite a nuanced way. So dealing with some of this stuff, looking at deeply into like projects that are making certain claims and whether they're actually addressing power in a way that they claim to be. So that work, yeah, is also really looking at some of this stuff in the context of data-driven technologies. Yeah.
I think that might actually be a good link to then for Panya to ask you a question. You're on mute, Panya.
Hi, Tega. I'm really interested in the work you and Sam did in looking into Facebook and their predictive technologies. And I just wonder what sort of discriminative taxonomies you've come across, and in the light of the events and our huge societal changes we need to make. I just wondered if you had to perform an audit into Facebook's technologies, sort of which sort of, and into their, if you had to perform an audit, what recommendations would you give to make it sort of actively anti-racist?
Well, I would just say they should get rid of their algorithmic timeline. Like if posts unfold in chronological order, then you're not targeting like certain groups with certain content. And then you don't have these issues with categorization, classification, discrimination based on your identity of some sort or your context. So, I mean, I think it's really simple also with Twitter. It's just like, it's the algorithmic timeline, but they will never do that because that's their whole business model, is that algorithmic timeline and being able to say, oh, I can target this context to, this group of 30 people or 100 people or 10,000 people. Yeah, I mean, the New Organs is the project you're talking about. And just for those of you who haven't seen it, it was a project where we got really interested in how over, the course of like a year or two, all of a sudden, like everybody has this story about how they think their phone listened in on a conversation. It still happens to me like all the time, right? I'll say something like the other day, there was this protest happening here with BMX bikes, right? And I was like, oh my God, it's so amazing. There's like 300 BMX bikes going around New York. Just said it out loud. And then next time, opened Instagram, there's a like ad for a BMX bike, and you're like, how is this happening? And so we really just started with that question, and we were invited to do a project with Mozilla, and we're thinking about like, what does a platform and the reach that Mozilla has, what question does it let you ask that maybe you couldn't ask without that kind of support? And so we decided to crowdsource people's experiences with creepy ads. So we asked, if you've had one of these experiences, like, please tell us what happened and what you think happened. So we got maybe like 1,200 responses or so that were really wide ranging, from like people saying, oh, I typed this search into Amazon and then I started seeing ads for it. And you're like, yeah, that's how Amazon works. So there's sort of a lack of literacy around how platforms work still, through to like full-blown conspiracy theories being laid out for us around, surveillance and how people thought they were being surveilled and so forth. And then everything in between. But I think what became really clear is that even though people's sort of like understanding of the mechanism of what was going on behind these platforms, even though that might be incomplete, or they might not quite understand how data-driven advertising works, the feeling is spot on. Like, you are being surveilled and your stuff is being put into models, and those models are then being used to show you particular content based on people who are like you. So yeah, I think we talked to a lot of the people who contributed stories, and I think from that I really was thinking about, like, how do we sort of educate or do work that sort of reveals how these systems work. So we did put together a short film and interviewed a bunch of journalists who were looking at like the way that data is collected on platforms such as Facebook and then being used to show you certain things. Like people like Kashmir Hill are doing this work, folks at the Markup, which is a new technology investigative journalism outfit here. So we did a lot of sort of research to really try to understand like whether Facebook is actually listening to you. But I think what also I came out of it is like, if you really want to understand how these systems work, just go and post some ads on them, right? Like when you post an ad on Facebook, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can select people based on, you know, whether they're a Black Lives Matter activist, which we all know is stand-in for, you know, racial profiling, or based on their like income bracket, or based on, I think in Google you can do like a 1 mile radius around an address. And so you start to see and think through just the ways that, you know, political parties can use this data, or corporations, or like start to think through the different ways that people might use these tools. And, you know, this is, yeah, like playing out live right now, right? As we see Twitter sort of implementing different strategies to try to draw attention to misinformation, and Facebook is refusing to, and so forth. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I feel like I went off on a Facebook rant.
Could you expand on how shadow data fits into this whole format as well? Maybe.
Yeah, so we talked to Kashmir Hill, who I mentioned, who has done a lot of work on shadow profiles on Facebook. And a shadow profile is profiles that exist even if you don't have an account. So like if I accidentally at some point clicked share all my contracts with Facebook because, you know, maybe I was trying to send a message to someone or whatever, my mother, for example, who's in my contact list, her phone number then is associated with the name in Facebook's database, even though she's never signed up with an account. And then every time someone else has Laura Brain in their phone, maybe they've tagged her in a photo, you know, then all of a sudden there's like Facebook starts amassing a profile for this person who is actually never consented to being in the Facebook ecosystem at all. And it's interesting because, you know, Kashmir Hill's work on this has revealed that Facebook refuses to release information about this to these people. They say that they own all the data, or the person who uploaded the information owns the data, even though it's about, you know, somebody else. So it's really interesting kind of case study, I think, of like, yeah, ownership and consent. And I mean, Facebook's mission is to literally just build a social network graph for everyone on Earth. Like that is their mission. And it's incredibly valuable, right? Because it means, you know, if I go buy something on Amazon, then that company can advertise to everyone else who is connected in my social graph via the social graph that in Facebook will sell, right? So I think it made me just realize that, like when you realize that that's Facebook's mission and the people you may know algorithm is the most valuable thing they have and the thing they dedicate the most computational resources to as well, then you're like, oh, I get it. Like that's the most important thing to them. That's where their value is centered.
Thank you. I was wondering, Katie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was interested, I guess in particular in the context of some of the things you've been talking about social data. How important do you think that, you know, data literacy is? And in relation to some of your work, like the Fitbits, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the uses of obfuscating data, and kind of, yeah, and particularly in a kind of social context.
Yeah. So I think a couple things with that question. I think the conversation really has to be about systemic change. in that it's, I mean, yeah, a lot of the activist practices out there are sort of like, I hope this is changing, but like creating tools for individuals to protect themselves, right? So like browser add-ons, and this work is really important and does a lot of like education and literacy work, as well as genuinely providing you protections. I'm thinking of like ad blockers and things like that. But this is a systemic problem. These issues with, my phone is listening to me, or, Amazon's patents for detecting illness based on your voice, based on how you sound to Alexa. These aren't bugs. This is the way the system is designed. And so I think what we all need to be pushing for is like reform, regulation, or like I'd love to nationalize one of these things, but that's very unpopular opinion in the US, obviously. But I think like we can build browser add-ons for the rest of our lives, and unless we actually address the business model here and the context in which these companies are operating, you're never going to actually address the problem. You just address the symptoms. So Unfit Bits is a project that exists as a website, a video, and we made a zine, and we did all this stuff that showed how you can mimic a step by taking like a Fitbit and putting it on a string, or like putting it on your dog, or putting it on a metronome. And it was really inspired. We came to it in the moment that there were I think it was about 2015, and like all of a sudden in all the subways in New York, there were these ads for like insurance companies offering, if you wear this Fitbit, we'll give you a discount on your life insurance policies. And it's felt like this really big shift in like the monetization of personal data. And yet, anyone who's owned a Fitbit knows that the thing is pretty stupid. Like it can't tell if you're on a bike or if you're like and you're going somewhere, right? So we really wanted to like firstly draw attention to the fact that a lot is riding on these fitness data sets, even though the tracking and the technologies seem pretty imperfect. And there's lots of instances of them being used in court cases and whatnot. But somehow like data has this power and has this weight that's sort of like a personal account doesn't have that same weight. So if I go to my doctor and say, oh yeah, I've been running every day, like he wants to see the data, right? So but without a full acknowledgement that that's also imperfect. And so that's the conversation that we were trying to provoke with that project. It obviously also has this obfuscation level, right? Because we framed it as like, author your own fitness data set, take advantage of these insurance offers by keeping your Fitbit active even when you're not, this kind of thing. And so it is about obfuscation, yeah, and like authoring, sort of ideal health data so that you can take advantage of like a privatized healthcare system here in the US too. And it really is interesting because, we got a lot of feedback from the project saying this is lying, this is irresponsible, you're asking people to commit fraud. And then a lot of feedback saying this is the solution to this fitness problem, right? And like neither is actually spot on, right? I don't think it's fraud because, it depends what the context that the data is being used in, obviously. It is also not the solution here, right? Like it's completely preposterous to suggest that somebody is keeping their tracker active. Like that's not something we can actually do, right? So it's symbolic, that work, and I think it's a misreading of it to see it as an actual like legitimate activist tactic, like a lot of projects are, like that CV Dazzle is the same, right? It's didactic. It's done a lot of good work in teaching us how facial recognition works. But that said, like obfuscation is an interesting tactic, right? And it is a genuinely effective tactic sometimes. Like for example, I love this so much. I'm not sure exactly which police precinct was doing this, in which state in the US, but one of the police departments in the US recently had opened up like a contribute your video of like violent protests, and was asking people to contribute videos of like looting and like some of the things that have been going on here. And the K-pop stans in Korea started like spamming these submissions with their like K-pop fan videos, and completely obfuscated the whole thing and made it completely impossible for the cops to like use any of the submissions at all. So really beautiful like use of obfuscation to completely like derail that attempt. And I mean, on the flip side is this, I don't know if you have been tracking the controversy around the posting of the black square and the Black Lives Matter as part of the Black Lives Matter social media stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, there was that day when everyone posted the black square, and then everyone was like, hang on, like now all of a sudden I can't follow that hashtag at all because it's just full of black squares, and like, is this some terrible like, you know, white supremacy conspiracy thing to again like make these hashtags impossible to use and to find it make it more difficult to track actually what's happening. So I think obfuscation, yeah, like it's a totally interesting and potentially effective tactic. I think, you know, we should probably all be polluting our data sets as much as we can to make them less valuable.
Thank you. I think Yasmin might have a question that is linked to this theme as well.
Hey, Tiga.
Hey.
So it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you for coming to virtually see us. I've been following your work for ages. I'm most familiar with your unfit bits, which you talked about earlier. And my question is kind of on, I don't want to belittle your work to just one word, but I often imagine your work to be kind of critiquing neoliberalism through irony and parody. And I think you pay a lot of attention to language and the way that it's sort of used to portray, you know, technology in a certain light. I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts regarding whether you think of your work in that sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think humor and like satire has been really important in a lot of my projects. I don't know, I just think it's just what, like, if I'm entertained, like that's just, for me, it's like that will keep my interest then, and I'll just kind of pursue it. It is interesting though, in that, you know, Unfit Bits, Smell Dating, like these projects were all made in like the Obama era here in the States, right? Where there was this sense that there was more of a belief in government. There was less sort of insane like media manipulation going on. And there has been a massive shift, right, in the Trump era where, you know, like the greatest performance artist in the country is in the White House, right? And like, I don't feel like it's appropriate to keep doing the same style of work when narrative and language has been so like corrupted by the people in power. And I think, you know, this is a conversation that I have with Sam a lot, and I have with a lot of folks who have been doing similar work, you know, in the past, of what do we do now, right? It doesn't feel right to make some like kind of trolly project that's funny, but is maybe just contributing to the noise around particular issues. And so I think in response to that, I mean, the work I've been doing more recently has been like compiling these archives, right? So, I mean, Get Well Soon was a project we just released. We were asked to make a project kind of in response to the COVID situation. And so we made a project that scraped all the comments from medical GoFundMes. And so it's this beautiful data set of people like helping each other, mutual aid, sympathy, wishing each other well. And it's really a data set that we say that, you know, it shouldn't exist, right? There shouldn't be a need for GoFundMes where people have to like perform online to get support for whatever medical issues they might have. So I think that's been one kind of like response to this shift, is like trying to document and reveal harms being done, and yeah, like telling these stories around where we're at now. And yeah, I mean, it's like a humble thing to do, and maybe it doesn't feel like enough given the urgency of what's happening politically, but yeah, I think we're in a tough spot in terms of the state of the media and just the distrust that's just, you know, ubiquitous now in terms of like what stories are being told and by whom. And yeah, it makes it hard to sort of thoughtfully do some of this work, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to sort of think through some of these issues almost around using, yeah, as you say, parody or fiction as method, as an artistic practice, and sort of thinking of a couple of different artists like Eva and Franco Mates, or other people who have sort of done performance art in the public sphere. And yeah, like how you say now, in this sort of more post-truth moment, or sort of just thinking about how the media has been corrupted, and just like what your responsibilities are. And just sort of thinking back to some of your the previous comments, you were sort of talking about proposing what ifs and alternatives. And so I was just wondering how you kind of can marry these two things together, where maybe you are still imagining futures, or you're doing some active fictioning, but it's sort of grounded in data or kind of current harms. And like if you've come to any sort of new thoughts around that.
Look, I think it's real. I think there's still a lot of I think we all need that work still. But I think, you know, the critique of critical speculative design has been really effective, I think, in pointing to, you know, the privileged position of the people who've been doing it, the fact that, you know, some dystopian futures that have sort of been put out there are absolute lived realities for different communities. And so what is like this, like, yeah, conveying a dystopia is something that's very like rooted in the context that you're doing it from. That said, like, I think there's so much work to be done in sort of what ifs or imagining like livable futures. I mean, that's a very simple way to put it, but like the environmental movement has failed, and it has failed because it has continually used this narrative of we have to give this up, everything we're doing is wrong, you can't fly, you can't do this, you can't do that, austerity. And how can anybody get on board with that? Like, I don't think we're driven by guilt as you know, animals. So we need to really try to envisage like futures that are desirable, but like don't have the material impact on the biosphere that we currently have. You know, and obviously this is like a massive prompt that I don't have necessarily answers for, but right, our imagination for those sorts of futures is really underworked, under-realized. Like I can imagine the, like, you know, Minority Report surveillance dystopia, or the yeah, like any number of sci-fi dystopias that are so popular. Like we are so good at imagining those worlds and so bad at imagining, you know, worlds with more equality or less impact, or yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's...
Do you think? Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear what you all think too.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think it is a very difficult balance doing the work of imagining, like you say, livable futures, while also sort of being grounded in the current struggle, you know, and the whole idea of like staying with the trouble while imagining those futures is definitely a massive task. Yeah, but I think I'll probably hand off to somebody else because there's still quite a few questions, so we'll just keep going.
I think, Ishu, I might want to hear a bit more about the smell dating project and quantifying data that is, or kind of making data out of something that is quite abstract. So I think he could ask now.
Yes. Hello, Tega. So
Hi.
I think you already kind of addressed the problem, like in your former talk. You're talking like it's super hard to tackle the smell data, and like this kind of technology is really intangible at this moment. So what I think maybe is there maybe an alternative artistic way to quantify the smell, or yeah, because dating itself is a very complicated encounter. Like there are so many things happening. There's passion. Maybe there might be a more taxonomic way to quantify the smell data, which technology cannot suffice now.
I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but I mean, there's been a lot of attempts to introduce smell into media, right? Like smell cinema is a very old idea that in the early days of cinema, you know, there's these patents out there where smells get released from under the seats at certain moments throughout the films, or and more recently, like every few years, it feels like some startup does like a smell the internet type of device where you have some sort of like peripheral that you plug into your computer that can then release fragrance depending on what you're doing, or that you can like message smells or whatever. And I mean, I think it's interesting because it's so hard to instrumentalize in that way, in that all of those attempts, you know, we kind of chuckle at them because it seems so twee in a way, or so like I think part of the richness of smell as an experience is it's not like a digital representation of the world. It's like actual molecules like entering your body in a very like material sense. So trying to synthesize or simulate that feels like something I wasn't ever interested in doing so much. Does that kind of answer your question? I mean, there are, if you look at sort of some of the work that's happened in perfumery, that obviously has a like very long history. There are lots of different attempts to sort of create smell wheels or ways to like taxonomize smell. There's many different like attempts at this. But I think one of the beautiful things about it too is that like a lot of smell science is still super unresolved, right? Like the way the body interprets smell is still an area of science where there's controversies. You know, there's the theory that it's like about the vibration of the molecule, and then there's another theory that it's about like this lock key system where it's like the shape of the molecule is what allows your body to perceive it. But I mean, I just find it so beautiful that we don't actually know. Yeah.
Thank you.
James, would you like to answer your question? If you still ask your question, sorry.
Yeah, I can't answer it. I take mine's a little bit off the official subject on the corporate shadowing, but I was just curious if you could give any background or sort of information on the genesis of some of the projects, like the coin-operated wetlands in Deep Swamp. I found it kind of interesting. It's a landscape that's really, really important, but it often gets forgotten. It doesn't often get a lot of attention, like say mountains or beaches or all these other sorts of things. And I was rather pleasantly surprised to see not just one work, but two. There may be more that you've done that's associated with the wetlands. You even in the course of this hour, you mentioned the use of water in cities and sort of the failure to some degree of the environmental movement just a few minutes ago. I just didn't know if you could give more information on this project. I thought it was interesting subject.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my last job as an engineer, like a decade ago, was actually designing wetland systems to go in like city streetscapes, or at the bottom of housing developments, or this kind of thing. So I was working with them in this very specific way and specific context, where basically they're thought of as an infrastructure in a lot of ways now, where they provide, this whole idea of ecosystem services, which is like, if we are going to try to, take environmental processes and incorporate them into how we like put a number value on something or value something, how do we do that? And if we think about like what sort of labor it would take to filter water or filter air or create habitat, like, and a wetland does that, then you can kind of start to make an economic case for like implementing and constructing them in different places. Problematic, the other side of that is like, does that mean that like everything has to have an economic value and that life forms don't just have an intrinsic place that needs to be supported in the biosphere? Like, that tension is something also ongoing for me. But so yeah, I was doing work where like, designing wetlands and putting them in housing development and stuff. And so the coin operated wetland was, I guess, kind of trying to think through, rather than seeing them as this kind of like end of pipe solution, where we have this like really unsustainable development, we flatten some forest to build a neighborhood or whatever, and then we're going to stick a wetland on the end of it, and it complies with like environmental regulations, so everyone's happy. But it felt like, as a sort of like idealistic, second year out of engineering school environmental engineer, I was just like horrified that this was my job, was to like make these developments slightly less bad, basically, is how I felt. And it's complex, right? Because it's better that that's happening than nothing. Right. But we could do so much better. What are we doing like with these sort of old ways of building cities?
Right. It's actually interesting to me that you're talking about deliberately adding them onto communities, because part of the reason I'm interested in it, my family's from an area of wetlands in the southeastern United States, and the pattern there is that it's almost like considered useless land, and so they'll often fill in the wetlands to put communities, and then they get confused why it floods all the time, because the wetlands are deliberately there to control, the water, not deliberately there, but they're naturally there to help control the flow of the water and everything else. And it's just funny, in some cities that are practically sinking into the ocean, they're deliberately building on top of the natural sponge, so to speak, that soaks up the water.
Yeah. So I think that's also why I've stayed fascinated with them, is because, like they're these environments that are in between, in an ecological space, they're called ecotones, which means they're transition zones between two different types of environments.
Right.
And so, like that, and they're also just like not aesthetically like desirable, right? If you read like the journals of like old explorer colonial guys, they're always like talking about, oh, we were going through this wetland and I had to turn around. Like there are these like obstacles to like progress in a lot of sense.
Right. I sometimes think almost when they talk about like how a lot of people will give a lot of money to save pandas, but people don't want to give money to save sharks. And it's almost a landscape-wise similar with swamps and wetlands. Like people want to go to the beach and people want to go to the mountains and people want these beautiful parks in those areas, but then it's like, do you want to go take a vacation in the swamp? And not many people really want
to. No, like, and they're full of mosquitoes and, they're these really kind of, like, I think.
But they're super important to the way those landscapes work, and the way the ocean works, and so many animals, are born there and, make their way out to the ocean afterwards.
Yeah, and they literally make coal. Like that's where coal is made. So I think also thinking about like carbon futures and how we have got into the situation we're in with the carbon cycle being so so disrupted. Wetlands are the place that is about carbon sequestration and the production of coal, like over a geological time scale, obviously.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm just keeping an eye on the time because we've got about 15 minutes left, and we've, inundated you with questions. Thanks so much for holding up and giving us so much wisdom and insight into your work. So I guess Vera just had a sort of a closing couple of questions or little mini discussion.
I think we could wrap it up with some tips or ideas or thoughts that you might have regarding this kind of collective residency. And for example, what I would be nice to hear if you think that certain kind of companies are, for example, interesting during this spring at this moment. And also one very initial idea we have had would be to adopt and subvert some tools from design and corporate brainstorming to actually use in our practice. And I think one example that has been in our documents has been a concept of cultural probe, using that kind of design practice for planning activities that would reveal, for example, how people use these remote communication systems like Zoom, for example, and where the tech fails to provide the contact they wish they had. And just in general, if you have any ideas or feedback regarding this.
I think the cultural probe is a really nice way to think through experiments you can do to sort of reveal social conventions that emerge on platforms such as Zoom, or what interactions it sort of fosters, and then what it really leaves out. And I think everybody's learning about this right now, so it is a really interesting sort of case study. I think it, and also I do a lot of teaching too, so there's obviously a big conversation happening in education of what Zoom and teaching online gives you, and then what its limitations are, or what how it sort of changes the dynamics of a group interaction or of a classroom. And so it sort of, it like so many technologies, it sort of presents this kind of democratized perspective where everybody's in the same size box and we're all flattened in this interface together, but in the same way we all are having these our intimate private spaces that we're living in, we're sharing those with each other that we never would have done before, right? And so there's lots of kind of revealing things that happen with that, especially in terms of class and people's context and what their lives are like. So I think that's really fascinating. I could imagine maybe you guys could do some Zoom experiments together. One of my favorite artists is Lauren McCarthy. I'm not sure if you've come across her work, but she does a lot of work around how technologies might help or hinder or create new spaces in terms of social interactions and sociality. And in one of her classes, she gives her class a assignment called social hacking. And it's based kind of on a older sociology assignment exercise where you sort of deliberately have to go out in the world and break a social convention. And the classic brief is you have to go onto the subway, so obviously it's pre-pandemic times, and you have to ask someone for their seat, right? Which is such a simple gesture, right? Can I have your seat? But it breaks so many social conventions, particularly if you're a big tall man. That's just not something that's right, that it feels appropriate. And, you know, like the students are really uncomfortable and like it's this very awkward thing. And like the more awkward it is, the more you know you're like transgressing some kind of like unspoken convention. And so she gives that assignment, but in the context of like digital social spaces, right? So like do a subversion or like do a social hack like that, but in a digital space. And so, you know, she's had students who will like, you know, swap mobile phones for a day. And so you're like taking care of someone else's phone, dealing with all their messages, answering their calls, you know, and so that's like this sort of transgression of like what we imagine the phone to be, which is kind of like a stand-in for our online subjectivity or our personhood online in a way. So I wonder what some experiments that kind of break conventions in a space like Zoom might be like, or might show you. I'm going to have to look up the artist's name, but I saw recently that throughout the pandemic, I think a performance artist, I'll find it and I'll send it on to you folks, was doing these like Zoom like performances where she asks everybody on the Zoom call just to sit with their eyes closed for 15 minutes, like, so 15 minutes. And she would do these like with different groups of people. Yeah, and I thought that was a very beautiful, like kind of like probing kind of way of exploring the Zoom experience. Obviously, it would become much more, I think, about auditory presence. So yeah, I think doing stuff like that might teach you a lot about how this interaction that we're all sort of engaged with is sort of unfolding. I mean, I've seen lots of experiments with the backgrounds and people recording videos of different things or of themselves.
Yeah, we have had actually like been thinking about Ingrid's birthday parties that taking place over Zoom and like exploring it as like a really informal meeting or
yeah, I mean, I think more could also be done with like rituals around Zoom meetings, like, because one of the weird things I found is, you know, the internet is just like flattens all experiences in a way that is really obvious right now, right? Like I can watch the performance of some like fancy artist on the Whitney Museum's website, and then literally go to a movie night with my friend who's like, you know, streaming some movie in really bad quality over Zoom. And it all feels the same because like you're sitting on the same couch with the same computer in your like yoga clothes or whatever. And so I think, yeah, I've been thinking about like, is there a way that one could invite people into sort of ritualizing different Zoom calls? Like, I don't know if that means like setting up your space differently, or could you mail people like objects that then become a central part of the call? Or, you know, how can you like create a sort of different bodily experience in the context of endless streaming? Like personally, one of my favorite Zoom moments is when people's kids interrupt them. And maybe that's because I don't have kids, so I'm not like dealing with the nightmare of no childcare right now. But like, for me, it just always feels so lovely that there's this sort of like, these different levels of interaction that play out that you don't get in normal professional, like, you know, in-person, situations. So again, I would say like, look at the awkwardness. Like, where is the awkward moments? And they're the things to really like dig into. Why is it awkward? Or, yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we've sort of come to the end of our time a little bit here. And in the interest of keeping Zoom time, you know, kind of nice and clean, we'll probably wrap up now. And I just wanted to say a massive thank you for joining us. This has been a really amazing and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much. And if there are no more sort of closing statements, we can probably switch off the live stream, and then we'll say our goodbyes after that. Yeah.
I want to thank you as well, and wishing you good luck with the other projects that you are working with now.
Yeah, thank
Weird
you. Yeah, it's been
times.
really fun.
Yeah, great. Cool. So Rob, we can thank you very much for joining us, to anyone who's watching. Yeah, we're going to go offline now.
Thank you. Bye.